Hello.
Hi guys.
Hello.
Good time of day.
Oh, again, a very full agenda.
Almost look like we're doing a release.
Yeah, it's like
Sorry?
incredible.
Hey.
Um,
Oh,
Friends.
hello.
Got an exciting agenda today.
It's packed again.
Luckily, we have our overflow just in case, but hopefully we'll be able to get through. A lot of these are listed as only a few minutes, but we always know how those go. A lot of them are late stage RFCs, which is fantastic. We are like more motion in the draft spec than there's been in a long, long time. Just keeping track of the number of our attendee lists and how many folks are actually here. You've got 11 on the call. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on our attendee list. So I think we're past quorum. We'll get started. All right, friends, welcome. It is June already. Holy smokes. And we have quite the agenda of interesting stuff to dig through today. As we always do, kicking off is just a quick reminder that by everybody joining these calls, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guides, code of conduct. Links to all of those docs are posted at the top of every agenda file for you to peruse. And by the way, we've also we got a little disclaimer that we, of course, record these meetings every time and publish them to YouTube. And we're starting to use summarization tools in addition to our classic note taking. We now have AI summaries as well, which is quite helpful to go back through previous ones to make sure we remember what we actually talked about. Also, as we always do, we want to do a quick name to face introductions of everybody on the call, which is very helpful to make sure everyone's AV is working correctly. We will go through in the list in the order of the list in the agenda file. So if you have the agenda file open, I'm going to post it in the chat just to make sure we're all in the same place. And we'll go down the list top to bottom. If you happen to not be on that list yet, for whatever reason, just send a quick PR to add yourself there, please. And we'll start at the top, which is me. My name is Lee, everybody. And I'll hand it off to Stephen. If Stephen is here.
Hi, folks. I'm
Which he is
Benji.
not. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Rob.
Hello everyone, Martin.
Mark, sorry.
Hey,
Hey,
Benoit.
folks, and sorry, I jumped the gun. Hey, I'm Jess.
Hello, I'm Alex.
It's so bad.
We are out of sync. Hi, Michael.
Wait, did we get all right? Sorry, we're jumping all over the place. Come on, folks, we're reading in the order of the list. We did. I think I saw Benoit there. We definitely heard Alex. Jeff, you're up.
Oh boy, was I that out of date? Hey, I'm Jeff. It's UDP, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Pascal.
I'm Michael from Chili Cream.
I'm Jory from the Linux Foundation, and this is deeply amusing. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Welcome. If Stephen pops in later, we'll let him say hello. Okay, I'm going to do a very quick scan over of our agenda, but I'm looking and there are 22 bullet points in this list. So we're going to do our best to stay on time today. And if we miss some of the last pieces, then we will pick those up in the secondary meeting. But just a quick overview. We are going to have a quick word from Jory about a discussion topic, AI and GraphQL. We're then going to talk about GraphQL over HTTP. And then we have a handful of RFCs. I will not list all of them out. I hope everyone gets a chance to go read through the agenda. But is there anything not on the agenda that folks want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about today? I'm very happy there's silence because we already have quite the long list. But if you think about something that you're like, oh, shoot, I wanted to make sure we talked about that, feel free to send a PR, just tack it on at the end. We'll keep track of the things we miss or preemptively add it to the secondary meeting. Okay, with that, we'll kick it off. I'm going to hand things over to Jory to get us talking about AI and GraphQL.
Hello. So this topic came up in our marketing committee meeting. Jen, our marketing chair, suggested that we start to think about, because I don't know if you've heard of our new Lord and Savior AI. Lots of people are, and lots of projects are starting to kind of put together, you know, some statements or blog posts or content that help people relate their technologies to the new hotness. We want to probably avoid the hype train, right? That's not what we're about. We're about real stuff. We're about sort of tangible, um, practical things that people are shipping and doing today. But we have a proposal to maybe target a software developer audience who's starting to build for that marketplace. And the question to the TSC is sort of, what role do we want to suggest that GraphQL plays in that ecosystem? So the request to you all is maybe to think about some of those questions and help us kind of shape what our foundation sort of approach to this topic will be, what the strategy might look like in terms of talking about AI and GraphQL. And we want that to come from, again, like a real strong technical foundation. That is the topic. I know Stephen has probably something to say about that. And we've got a little bit of an outline with some questions that I'll pop into Zoom chat. Um, Jeff, I know Jen is your colleague. Do you want to kind of maybe add some additional color to that as well?
I'm just really curious to get any perspectives, I think, out there. I know this group, your perspectives would be extremely helpful in adding a dimension and weight to the piece.
I'm gonna pop some of these questions in chat. We don't have obviously time to like open that as a discussion. You've got 22 bullet points and many RFCs that are more timely. But we do want to put together some content from the foundation marketing side and start to kick off a conversation with you all. I may also share a document with the TSC if that's cool in a discussion where you can kind of start to help us collaborate on some responses as well. Do you have any concerns about this as well? I mean, this is all a team sport. Um,
No concerns. As long as we don't generate the content, it's okay.
like, yeah, like have it. Oh, well, I'll drop this like futurism article I read yesterday on this. You'll like it too. Hold on. Let me find that. Okay. I want to just again be respectful of the time because y'all have so many other topics to get to. So, but I'm gonna hang out because you're entertaining and I want to hear about a particular maybe plan for spec release this year, maybe. I don't know. So I'm gonna go on mute and thank you. And please let me know if you have any questions or if you need anything. I'm here to help you.
Thanks, Story. Maybe one last thing to add on this topic. Obviously, it's going to be an interesting thing for us to speak to at GraphQL Conf later this year, and we'll continue to ramp up. I think there's probably like the classic product building that happens to be AI native products where GraphQL is used in a traditional way, and then other places that start to like bend that, like GraphQL developer tools that have support for agentic behavior or something like that. I think those are just inevitable that they will happen at some point, and very likely this audience are the set of folks who will be thinking about that. And one is we want to like steer people to good patterns, and the other is that as we see things that we think are really interesting that are putting pressure on what GraphQL does and how it does it, then we should be like cycling that back to this group to frame up as RFCs. And anything that looks like those shape of things is absolutely worth like broadening the discussion about, which Jory can help us with. Awesome. Thank you, Jory. We will turn things over to Benji on the topic of GraphQL over HTTP.
Awesome, thanks. One other comment is you don't have to be a TSC member to comment on this either. So any other working group members who have interesting thoughts on this, please get involved. Okay, on to HTTP. So the GraphQL over HTTP spec is basically ready to go. There is one tiny last piece to the puzzle, and that is we would really like to introduce a partial success HTTP status code. The idea being that anyone who is not passing response bodies, but wants to be able to know the status of something using their standard monitoring software that most likely monitors like HTTP status codes to see whether there's more errors than usual, at the moment can't see what's going on in GraphQL responses because it's all 200 OK. Excuse me. So we talked about using some of the existing GraphQL HTTP codes, but none of them really fit. There's, for example, 203, which is for non-authoritative, where a proxy transforms it. I might be getting these numbers wrong because this is all from memory. There's like 206, which I think is partial content, 207, which is for multi-status for WebDAV, which is for when you have lots of independent requests and you want to report their status independently, but that doesn't really apply to GraphQL because our requests aren't independent. They are chained, nested remote procedure calls effectively, and a few others. None of them really fit. So what we are currently proposing is that we just pick a new one, 294, 94 being leet speak for PA partial, and just go with that because no one's using it. So I would love to hear from people if they know of anything that this would break. If there are proxies that they know this will break, if there are gateways, if there are firewalls or any other kind of tooling that using a new status code like this would break. Also, if anyone has any particular concerns or feels that we should go in a particular direction, now would be a great time to raise it. I'll open it to the room for just a moment to see if anyone has comments. Otherwise, we can move on.
How could we make this official? I mean, is there a way to get a new status code reserved?
It would go through the IETF.
Do we want to do that?
Maybe.
I'm just saying because otherwise somebody else comes in and.
I mean, we can put it on the Wikipedia page and then it's semi-official.
Yeah, but so I can think of 1,000 problems this can cause, right? Firewalls or old proxies, they're always a bit strict on these things. And so it could cause a lot of issues that we cannot even foresee.
Yeah, so I'd love to add some concrete examples to that.
I'm not really adverse with the HTTP specification. Like, are they meant to be just dynamically extended? Like, is any 200 officially considered a success status code? And
yeah,
like,
so
when you implement an HTTP layer or a proxy or a gateway or whatever, like if you use a framework, is there any way that this could explode because it's not an official one? Or is it meant to be, you can use whatever you want, it just needs to be in this range?
it's a bit loosely defined, but essentially, yes, all 2XX status codes all indicate success, and HTTP in its spec defines that it is meant to be extensible. That said, it does also seem to indicate that all the status codes that exist should also be in that spec, but it's done in a really weird, not particularly tight language. Other specs do, like WebDAV, for example, do add status codes that aren't in that spec, for example. There are also commonly other status codes, like, I'm a teapot, for example, that were added by other things. It's very common to add status codes, like Cloudflare has its own status codes. If you look at the Wikipedia page, you'll see that this is actually quite a common thing to do. And if you're adding them, you tend to add them in the very high end of the numbering system. So I wouldn't say it's a supported pattern, but it is not a pattern. It is a pattern that happens quite frequently. And we would essentially be only using this when combined with our media type. Anyway, my call to the group isn't to discuss that so much, because that, if you're interested in that, come to the GraphQL over HTTP working group and we can discuss it at length. What I would love to know is, do you have examples of concrete pieces of software that will definitely break if we use this status code, rather than hypothesizing that it might break a bunch of stuff? I would love some concrete examples. So if you have them, please bring them. Otherwise, we'll just ship it and see what breaks.
I don't know offhand specific ones, but the like weird and old versions of proxies and things is exactly the set of stuff that I would be nervous about. There's just like an infinite supply of underdocumented and underbuilt software powering the internet that all makes assumptions about how HTTP works. So we could just ship it, but I think the odds that we will encounter some such system in some corner of the internet is non-zero. So my suggestion would be to introduce it in a way that it is not required. Like if someone finds themselves stuck up against some poorly built proxy that's between them and their users, like they need some mechanism to escape that. And also my understanding is that defining new codes in the 200 range is frowned upon for this reason, because there are only 100 of them and a bunch of them are already claimed, and it is very easy to step on each other's toes. And so like we should feel strong conviction that a status code is really the only way to represent this, as opposed to like 200 plus a header, in which case you read a few handful more bytes, you get your headers, and then x dash GraphQL dash whatever tells you the thing that you needed to know. Would be less likely to be borked by an intermediate proxy, and less likely also to be, we find that some other group of well-meaning individuals like ourselves in some other corner of the open source internets has like accidentally claimed the same status code and it means something wildly different. And so like hopefully we've named space stars because it's like you have to use the it only makes sense in the context of GraphQL, but it always makes me nervous. Anything touching the HTTP spec makes me nervous for this reason.
Yeah, I think that what we would do is probably try and push it through the IETF, but I think would need to be using it first. So
Yeah,
it's one of those chicken and egg problems. That said,
that's what
we have
all of the that's what all of the proxy, or not proxy, sorry, CDN layer folks who have extended HTTP spec over the years have done, is they did the ask for forgiveness approach to just like claiming a code, giving it a well-meaning, and then their CDN gets super popular, spans across the internet, and everyone realizes like browsers are starting to implement support for this code that's like not documented anywhere. And then the IETF feels forced to document it clearly. It's like, that's what happens.
Yeah, and we definitely chose to do this with a should, not a must, specifically because then whoever would implement this, you'd be doing it on the back end as part of your server, and you would also be the person most likely in charge of all of the intermediate services anyway. So if you're breaking yourself by using this status code, just don't. But I still think that we should recommend it. Let's move on.
Cool. All right. Great discussion. Thanks, Benji. Stephen, you're up with descriptions on executables.
All right. So this is an this came about recently. I was working on just like a side project that was defining MCP server using GraphQL operations, and you need descriptions, you need context, ideally on the operation itself, and in doing this, I realized that right now we have descriptions are allowed syntactically in schema, but not in operations. So in operation, the general workaround is to just use comment lines, which is the same thing we did in SDL before descriptions were a thing in the SDL, and that works. But seems like it'd be better to be able to have a first class multi-line description string on operations. And I thought, oh, I should propose this. And then I thought, of course, most good ideas have already been proposed at some point in the last decade. And so turns out 2021, Yvonne proposed this and even wrote spec edits and a GraphQL JS implementation. And so I brought this up at recent not primary working group meeting, and we went ahead and moved it from RFC1 to RFC2. And so the work I'm currently doing is the GraphQL JS implementation. I've dusted that off, put it on top of the current main branch of GraphQL JS, and working on getting that build and the test passing and build succeeding. So there's the GraphQL JS implementation, and then there are a few bits of feedback on the spec edits itself that need to be incorporated as well. So I just wanted to update on what's happening there, and then also if there's any other feedback that we want to go ahead and incorporate at this stage to get it into a final form, and also any dissent or thoughts of like, no way, we just really shouldn't do this, because now would be a good time to surface that. Voilà.
Sweet. Thank you, Stephen, for picking this one back up. Just to do a quick recap, we talked about this in, was that 2 weeks ago, the last secondary meeting, and decided to move it from RFC1 to RFC2, which was slightly optimistic, but we had basically seen that there was, in fact, a working pull request that Stephen was in the process of updating, and this spec text looks pretty good, though it needs to be rebased and touched up a bit. But as soon as we do that, this is essentially on a fast track to getting approved. So if anyone has detailed feedback or has any concern with this making its way to being approved, certainly speak now. This one's hopefully an easy one, and also love a good callback to the AI discussion, Stephen. Thank you. Okay, we'll hold that one there. That's a good call to action for folks to go take a look at that late stage one. Benji, don't include schema. That one is up for you.
Cool. So this is a minor, I would say editorial, except it's not, because it concretely changes the behavior of the spec. But I think it's a bug fix to the spec. Essentially, at the moment, we say if you define a schema where you only use the default root operation names, then you can exclude the schema keyword from your definition. But that also means that you would drop the description of the schema if your schema has a description. So this purely just updates the spec to note that and basically say, if it has a description, don't drop it. Yeah, that's all.
Cool. I think, has this been built for GraphQL JS?
I think it already works in GraphQL JS, but I can check.
Let's have the unit test to make sure.
Yeah.
Does anyone have feedback or thoughts on this? I see a boatload of checks on the existing PR, which is always a good sign. All right. I'm going to bump this one straight from RFC0 to 2 because it is a extremely well-defined and small change. But it does require us to complete want to make sure we have the GraphQL.js change in place and unit tests that test that if you have a description on a schema that it gets printed correctly.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll move us on to the next one. So the next topic is adding assert consistency to the algorithm. This is purely editorial, but we have a mixture of assert colon and assert with no colon in the algorithms, and we like to be consistent. So this just adds a format check for that and adds colons in the places that didn't have them, since the colon was the dominating factor. I think it's pretty trivial, to be honest.
Cool. Love the check piece that you've added there. I'll just merge that one now. Great editorial change. Thanks, Benji. Cool. Let's talk about schema coordinates. Mark.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for pushing me to bring this back from the dead. It's been a while. Also, I have 2 toddlers right now. I'm home alone. Apologies. I'm going to do my best here. I might ask Benji to take over, actually, to spare you all from the screaming just for a moment. I'm really sorry. Benji, would you mind reintroducing this while I get them some more chips?
Yeah, sure. We can't hear them, so it's fine. Yes, so schema coordinates. We want a nice way to refer to the to things in the schema like types, fields, arguments, directives, and enum values and directive arguments. So those are essentially our 6. So the idea behind this is that we have this standard syntax for doing so. Lee wrote up the GraphQL.js implementation a couple years ago. We never quite got as far as merging it. I brought it back to life recently because like I want to start using it all over the place and it's still not in the spec, so let's get that fixed. In doing so, we got some pushback from Yovi, maintainer of GraphQL.js, that essentially he wasn't happy with using the word member to refer to both fields and enum values, because we were using a standard syntax for that. So essentially we've done a last minute change today where we've indicated that enum values should be done with a double colon, as is the pattern in Rust, C++, PHP, Perl, and a number of other programming languages. So essentially, this is a last minute change to that, but I would like to get some approval towards getting this merged into the spec, hopefully for this cut.
Yeah, thank you for that, Benji. And then like one open question was around meta fields. I think like if we take no action, we're just gonna go ahead and not allow meta fields. There's also like introspection types as well, which sort of correlate, which we could prevent as well. So, but yeah, Lee, I think it blames to you. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts there.
Seems good. I'm trying to think through how I feel about the enum value changing. I don't super love the double colon, but I appreciate that it has precedent in other languages, and I also appreciate the desire to make type dot field always mean field and not be ambiguous based on what a thing is. That seems quite nice.
Can it be ambiguous? Like, I mean, when you look up resolve the coordinate, because you're referring to the type and then you.
If you do it with a schema, then you can look it up and you will know what it is. It's not ambiguous.
Exactly.
But the issue is if you just look at it on its own, it looks like type.field, but sometimes it might be type.enum, and without looking at the schema, you don't know which one it is. And those are 2 very significantly different things, like an enum value versus a field.
Yeah, it relies on conventions around capitalization.
Yeah,
to interpret on its own without the schema.
Yeah, and just for like what it's worth from my perspective, I kind of like that change, even though it's like very, very recent, especially as you're throwing around these things in like a, you know, big company or whatever, and you like not as familiar with the scheme, you're just saying, hey, use this thing, then I think that has like a lot of value there. So yeah.
The one concern I have around this is that coordinates are already used in a lot of places, and it's really a last minute change.
Yeah, I mean, we for me it was always like you have a type, you have a member, and then you may have fields. So I kind of like this this simplicity of a schema coordinate. I do understand the comment here that the value is very different from a field, but it kind of still is a member, isn't it, of the type, so to say.
You also arguably have union members, but they explicitly don't get their own coordinates because they effectively refer to the underlying type. So there is confusion around member there as well.
Yeah, I think last time this was discussed, we decided that we did not need a schema coordinate to describe a type in a type union. That was unlikely to come up, but if it does, then we would probably want some kind of syntax that lets us refer to that.
I mean, there is use cases for it, right? You can very easily point to the usage of union members specifically. So you don't just get the, like, if you just log all the coordinates that are used, it's actually quite nice that you can say that actually the union or the interface actually has similar issue, but the union, it's the thing that you return, but then you have to somehow count it's difficult to say which members of a union are actually used with the coordinates at the moment. So I would see value of it. It's not something that we need to have to get this merged, but there's definitely use cases for having also the members of a union.
Yeah, I would suggest if that is something that we want, we can write that up and maybe have that as a, an amendment, like a future thing. I think it should break, the API for right now.
The question is, what characters do we then use?
Well, I'm looking at my keyboard. There's and dollar signs. Yeah, we can figure something out.
So the type name $$ value then designates him a member.
We should also keep in context of how these are going to be used, right? Like the fact that if you have a schema and you have a schema coordinate, then you should be able to get to the actual point into the schema. And that does not require unambiguous syntax, right? Like as long as the grammar doesn't matter, like as long as you have the chain of names, you're good to go. And then the other is just human legibility, in which case I think on balance, the double colon is probably better because enums are fairly popular and fields on types are obviously extremely popular, and seeing a mix of those could plausibly be confusing, and the removing that confusion is worthwhile. But if someone here, like if a bunch of people here felt really strongly that the double colon was weird, or maybe we lived in a universe where there was no precedent for this, like every other language used dot, then it would be okay, right? Like it would be okay. You would look at that and you would figure out from context by looking at the first name, like, oh, that's the name of the enum type that I'm staring at. So obviously the dot whatever is one of the enum values. And so like if what we're talking about is human legibility, then for a union type, we're gonna just find ourselves stuck between, on one hand, we're gonna repeat some syntax, and on the other hand, we're gonna invent some crazy new thing that no one's ever seen before that they'll have to figure out what it means. And it'll be okay if we decide to repeat syntax for that case.
There's also like if you follow GraphQL best practices, you actually see that it's an enum value, right?
Yeah.
Like in most cases, you can distinguish it without the colons.
Because the best practice is to use all caps.
Yeah.
For enum values. Yeah. And there's a handful of tools that really kind of force your hand on that as well, depending on how often you use those tools.
And
I mean, just from working with coordinates a lot, like when we store coordinates, we store a lot of meta information anyway for it. Like it's not enough to know that it's an argument. You actually store, like it's not enough to know it's a field. You actually store much more meta information around it to actually build up something on the tracing side, for example. Like for a schema lookup, we all agree that it doesn't matter what separator you use because it's a three-part problem. You have the first part which designates the type, you have the second part which designates the member, and then you may have an argument. You can also may have a member when you just point to the type. So looking up stuff is actually super simple now, right? You can just pass it in, and it's at most a 3-hop problem, and then you're at the location in the schema. So this problem is solved independently of what we have as a separator. Now, if you actually want to build tooling around it, you will have more metadata anyway, because you need to know if this is an interface field, because an input field, because an input field has very different characteristics on this part than an output field, even though they look the same in the schema coordinates. So I'm like, as said, it's a thing that already existed a long time. It's already used. I know it's just a spec draft, but I would really reconsider changing it to a colon if it's worth it or not, because what does it help, right? We have the same problem in the union. Then, like, do you use a dot, or do you use colon, or
Yeah, I think it goes back to that thing, like if you're just passing around a string to pass it to a coworker to say, hey, like use this thing, looking at that is immediately obvious as an enum, whereas it might not be if you have a dot, right? As far as needing extra meta information and stuff, totally agree, right? Schema coordinate as written is used as a like the lookup key, right? You would add on that information, but for the purposes of just like uniquely identifying a schema element, I think that the spec does that, and that's all it's trying to do, right? It's not trying to do anything else other than the canonical. This is the thing that I'm pointing to in the schema, and like all your other tooling can build around that. So yeah, it's quite tight, and that's it. Not a bug, etc.
I'm on the fence of this one, honestly, because you can just send it to your coworker and they'll know what it means. Also makes some implications of like what languages they're familiar with. Like if your team is a Rust development team, then they certainly will immediately understand what that means. But if your team is a TypeScript, Swift, or Kotlin team, which by the way is the vast majority of the people who are consuming GraphQL services, they all use dot for enum members. And you might look at this double colon and your immediate thought is, what is that? And then it takes you a moment to realize like, oh, that's an enum and that's a value. The double colon must mean an enum member. Whereas the dot there, you wouldn't even blink, you would know what it meant.
also
And
Java.
especially if Java, which is the rest of the, where Kotlin comes from. And then, it's also convincing to me that, the GraphQL best practice, I appreciate not every service adheres to this, but certainly a healthy plurality, if not majority do, is to use all caps to represent the enum values. Then you would see, dot and then all caps. We generally have, I think we write it in the spec that if the thing starts with an uppercase letter, it's a type. If it starts with a lowercase letter, it's a field or an argument. If it's all caps, then it's an enum value. At least we use that convention throughout the spec. So it seems like from a human legibility point of view, if you are adhering to that best practice, it is unlikely to be confusing if you use a dot.
Okay. I mean, like from my perspective, I can kind of see it both ways. So I'm not like dogmatically type one or the other. I'm very happy to revert back to what we had if that satisfies the most people. Is that kind of a decision that we want to make here and now? And then I can try and sneak that change through, or do we want to have more time for this to marinate?
My advice would be for folks that feel strongly about this to continue the discussion on this thread. And my personal opinion is to reduce the surface area of the grammar. In my intuition is telling me that that will end up being the right thing in the long run. And by that I mean like you go back to using the dot instead of the double colon. And I think the thing that's really convincing me that that's the case is actually this, like, what about a member of a union type? How do we represent that? And my immediate thought is like the intuition would be type, and that would just tell you this is a union type and that dot type is a member of that union. And now we're right back to the dot being overloaded again, in which case, like, what value did we get from enums being the one thing that lost that or got out from under that being overloaded, when there's like a whole bunch of other stuff that's also still overloaded. And so I think if we can come up with some other convention to make the dot operator and schema coordinates feel reasonable, and if that is just, hey, we have like casing best practices in GraphQL, and there's legibility reasons for that, and here's what they are. We want to clearly articulate those in the spec. Maybe we want to clearly articulate them right here in this grammar summary. The other thing is, even back in 2021 where we brought this up, it was sort of a little bit of a retroactive specification. It's like there are tools that exist that refer to things into the schema, and this is roughly the syntax that they use. Let's codify it. And so like the hot late breaking change to use double colon would mean going back through all those tools, which are like officially not in line with the spec, and having to update them all. And keeping the dot would allow us to not do that, which seems worthwhile.
I don't honestly see many people actually referring to enum values in this way anyway, so I don't think that's likely to cause much problem. But yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just propose. I'm going to update the spec and the implementation to go forward with that then, and we can continue the discussion on GitHub. Is that like a good conclusion to this discussion, or do we want to have like a, if we do that then go forward, or like what would the next steps be there?
Any other open questions? I know you had, I think probably the right thing to move forward is to come out with a list of any remaining open questions. In case it wasn't clear, I'm very excited that you picked this back up. I really want to see this one get to conclusion and land, but it does sound like there's like some surface area of the schema that's not yet represented here, in particular members of a union type. But are there any other ones that are missing? Do we want to account for them in the proposal? The other one that you brought up was meta fields, and do we need to do anything special for a meta field? And if so, what? We should just have like very clear answers to these questions. And after that, I think we're like super solid. And then beyond that, just making sure that these are all rebased and ready to go, which it seems like between you and Benji, you've gotten them in a great spot. So I'm feeling very optimistic about getting this one wrapped up soon.
Cool. Thanks.
On the meta fields, I think, Lee, at the moment you're the only person who thinks that they shouldn't be included. Like you explicitly added to the spec or to the JS that the like dunder type name is not a valid schema coordinate. Do you remember why you did that?
No. No,
Fair.
I can't remember.
Okay. We might propose it with that rule removed, and then if you can think in the meantime why we wouldn't allow that, that would be helpful.
No, fair enough. Yeah, no, I think simpler is better, and certainly want to be able to refer to everything. And the meta fields are fields, so it seems right to add them back. I don't remember why I proposed not allowing them. All right, awesome. Thank you all both for getting that one back up and running. Very excited to see the progress. Rob, on to you to talk about execution result definition.
Yes. I've been looking in the response section of the spec and looking to tighten up some things with some definitions. And this is kind of a prerequisite for incremental delivery, as we'll be further building on these. And the idea is to define the response you get from a GraphQL request as a response, and that will be subdivided into a request error result, which is an error that's thrown before execution. And that response is where you don't have data, you have request errors, and a execution result where you do have data, which may be null, but it is in the response, and the error is defined there. And then finally, a response stream, which was language that we already used for what you get back for subscriptions, which is a stream of execution results. I have it kind of in TypeScript as in the description of the PR, and also just the general direction that I'm going to go in with incremental delivery. Yeah, so would love to get some eyes on this, and then I can keep building on top of it.
Nice. I owe you a final editorial read on this, but I'm extremely in support of this change. Even beyond it being a prereq for incremental delivery, it makes the type system of the top level of GraphQL much more coherent, which is huge.
Yeah, great. Does anyone have any thoughts on the names? Definitely let me know, or any other feedback.
Just to keep this crew up to date, Rob and I have been going back and forth a bit on how to think about the naming for these things, because there's a little bit of a family of types here, and we wanted to make sure that they were all worked with each other. So I feel pretty good about these names, but certainly it's worthwhile for folks to go in and give this one a read. This is a pretty meaningful top-level change. But Rob, I've probably got next action on this one, giving this a final editorial review before we merge it, but the intent is to get this one merged.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Benji, next one up is yours. Data collection trilogy.
Oh gosh. Yes, okay, so that was I think we brought this up before. There was a task on it. Was there? No, I think we were just waiting for people to look it over. So yeah, this is still waiting for some approvals. So please go put your +1 on it. But I think it's good to go. It's essentially just a definition of the list, set, and map types that we use throughout the spec algorithms. It is the part 1 of a trilogy. This one's editorial. The next one is editorial, and the one after that is actually an RFC, because it does change things to do with ordering. But yeah, just putting it back on the radar. I'm going to move us on to the next one in the interest of time, which is one of the task from last time. We made it RFC 3. The task was to bring it up to date. It did need a little bit of TLC to bring it back up to date, since we changed some of the terminology in the spec. I believe that is now complete, and it is now ready to be merged. So just want to put that on your plate for a final review, Lee. But I think that's it. Cool. And
This should be a little bit of a celebratory moment, because this one's been in the works for quite a long time. Thanks, Benji, in particular, for even proposing this one long ago as an alternate proposal for some of the other work that we were doing. and steadily chipping away at getting all the last bits and details right so that we can get this one merged.
I think for such a small change, it's actually really it's a really nice feature.
It's a super nice feature. I think if had we had this feature early on, we might not have ever introduced union types. Cool. Okay, well, the next action on that one is final editorial scan from me and then a merge. I consider this one on deck to be merged into the draft.
Perfect. Okay, next up is the prevent, skip, and include on the root subscription selection set. I think that this one also needed to be updated, which is now done. So again, this is also RFC3 ready to go. So again, just another thing on your plate, Lee.
This one I think is easier to get done because most of this is a clone of some logic that we already had, correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's essentially the same thing, but without variables.
Yeah, and we wanted to, before getting it merged, make sure that the GraphQL JS change was fully completed, which it now is.
Yeah, I think it's shipped even.
Fantastic. Cool. This one's a done or merged. That one's in the draft.
Ace. The next one is default value coercion rules. This is now, so this is RFC2 already. The task was to make sure that it syncs up with what is done in GraphQL JS. That has been confirmed by both myself and the maintainers. So yeah, that is also basically ready to go. You may remember this one from a long while ago, but it's essentially a I'm going to get myself confused on which one it is. It's well described in the issue description.
This was one of those that seemed straightforward until you unpacked the entire can of worms, which was the pipeline of how we create default values. And if I recall, I ended up having to draw a wildly complicated diagram that showed every step of the way and where each value got used. So I'm also super pumped to see this one wrapped up.
Yeah, I think we actually in GraphQL JS we implemented 2 forms of this now to help people transition. So people should use the new form of default value, but they can also use the older one so that they can upgrade without breaking and that kind of thing. But yeah,
Super smart.
it's well accounted for.
Cool. I'm gonna move this one to stage 3 and then we'll do a last pass editorial review. Unless there's anyone who thinks we should do otherwise. All right, that one's at stage 3 and on deck for me to do a final review.
Awesome. The next one I've titled Discussion, Section 3, Type System and Execution versus Request Error. This one is this one came out of the other work that we've been doing around being more precise about errors, and particularly with a thing that I think I wrote up in one of my other pull requests, which was essentially when coercion says it should raise a request error, since it's happening at execution time, you should instead interpret this as an execution error. As a general rule of thumb, we essentially have 2 types of errors. We have request errors, which happen before execution begins, and they result in a response that has errors but no data. And we have execution errors, which happen after execution begins, and they always have data, whether or not it's null, but they will have that property in the response. And generally that's the rule. But section 3 of the spec talks about the types and like how to coerce things and what to do when those coercions go wrong. And sometimes we do that before execution begins, like when we're coercing the variable values. And sometimes we do that after execution begins, like when we're coercing the argument values, or response from a resolver, like the actual output of a resolver. So that section of the spec talks specifically, I think, about request errors. It says raise a request error. And my question around this is like, should it just say raise an error? Like, what should we do there to make it consistent? Or is that sentence that I added in another pull request, I can't remember which one, saying essentially when it says request error, treat it as execution error is okay?
This is a good question. What's maybe another way to reframe this? That should there be truly two different kinds of errors, or is there just an error and then what kind of window of time or phase of running a query are you, or running an operation are you in, that results in a sort of a payload? Because it's like the type of error payload you get is different based on what phase you're in when the error occurs. So I could see maybe an argument for saying that there's just one kind of error and then we just understand based on it. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious what others think.
To just share my opinion on this, I think that there is request error and execution error. They are different things because they have essentially different properties, but they are the result of an error being thrown or raised. So I think section 3 should just say raise an error, and then in execution we should define what happens when an error is raised, in which case it then turns into a request error or a execution error, depending on the phase at which it occurs, essentially. Or even we should say raise a coercion error.
Do we want to create a new kind of error for coercion?
I think, again, it would be captured and turned into one of the other two. It just means that we don't have to use just the word error as a naked word, which I think would be problematic to define.
I mean, generally having.
I think it's worth investigating further.
Yeah, I mean, generally having specific errors for things will probably make sense. I mean, if you think about programming, right? If you just have an exception, it's bad. Like, you know that this error comes from coercion of a value.
But we are not talking about changing the errors, right? Would still be an error.
Yeah.
The observable end result for the user would be the same.
Yeah, that's what I'm
just in the spec, right?
Yeah, this is definitely editorial when we get down to it. For the sake of making some progress, I think it's worth investigating. My suggestion would be that this is not necessarily the highest priority thing of some of the other things that are on our collective plate, but if you feel so motivated, then like exploring this a little bit and seeing what would this look like to actually change in the spec. Does it end up making things easier to understand or harder to understand is worthwhile? Because if it ends up being on the optimistic side of that spectrum, then this will be a pretty cool simplification of the spec. And if it ends up being kind of middling, then you can figure out what you want to do with that.
I'm happy with the current sentence, to be honest, that just says treat request errors as execution errors because we're during execution now. But yeah, if we need to address it in order to advance the other error handling stuff, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, if this ends up being like a blocker, then it's worth making it more of a priority to dig into. I think your next topic of the selection set versus collect fields and defining execution is related, so I'll let you jump into that one next.
Yeah, so that's probably the main reason for this. Okay, so this is a for incremental delivery, and I think also fragment arguments, it's helpful to redefine the execute selection set algorithms in terms of actually executing what we call a grouped field set. So this PR is an editorial one that just goes through and refactors those algorithms. I think it's basically good to go and might just be pending review. But the reason it's on the agenda is because then it relates to the defining execution. Because we use the phrase before execution begins in a number of places in the specification, it would be really helpful to define when execution begins, which we don't at the moment. So combined effort by myself and Martin to essentially define this in terms of renaming the algorithms, the phases of the request. We brought this to previous working groups, and the consensus there was let's rename it from executing a request to processing a request, which we've done. We've also elided the word execute from things. So rather than execute query, we now just have query. Execute mutation is now mutation. Subscribe is now subscription, just to be consistent with the others, and so on and so forth. So I think that all of this is essentially also good to go. And again, it's just refactoring and renaming of things that we already have in order to make it easier to adopt incremental delivery and handle errors more consistently.
Okay, one piece of feedback is I feel like algorithm names should always read like verbs. They're things that you do. And so execute mutation was in a verb form. You're like doing a verb to a noun. And subscribe similarly was a verb. And so moving these back to query obviously is a bit of an awkward word because it can be a verb or a noun. So that one is a little bit strange. But if we want to think about a query as a noun in the system, then I think these operations should say what you are doing to the query, or say what you're doing to the mutation, or say what you're doing to the subscription.
Okay, so
Which could
essentially
just be like
rename.
perform query, perform mutation, perform subscription might also be fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
But anyway, that's nitpicky feedback. The rest of this I'm super excited about.
Cool. I'll get those names updated. Would you rather see perform, or would you rather see a method that's just called mutate? Because I honestly quite liked the eliding of the execute from the names, like simplifying down. But maybe it is clearer to perform mutation than it is to mutate.
Yeah, I think
it sounds better just to have it simpler. Subscribe, but
I'm always in favor of simpler, but I also want to make sure they are clear. My sense is that anytime you have an spec algorithm name, the sort of what it's doing, you should be able to build a sense of what it does by reading the name of the algorithm. Which is why a lot of them kind of read like verb noun pairings throughout the spec. And also the like getting the terminology consistent here is actually the important part, right? Like, are we performing something? Are we processing something? I think actually we are using those two terms interchangeably at the moment, unless they mean something different. Does it mean is it performing something different from processing something? So I think just like tightening up the language of what are the set of verbs that we use. Because execute was like we stretched the definition of that word, but it definitely means something specific in the context of GraphQL. So if we're introducing a new verb, then we should like be very careful to make sure that it has like a very crisp definition.
So at the moment, I think what we're proposing is that we process a request, we then perform the operation, and then we execute the selection sets, the group field set, whatever. I think that makes sense because like the process can choose not to go ahead if like it's not valid, whereas performing it would do the thing. So yeah, yeah, okay. I think that makes sense, and I think we'll go with the perform terms. I agree with Michael that like the simpler names are nicer, but I also agree with you that essentially using the operation name, query, mutation, subscription makes it a lot clearer to the reader what's going on. So performing that does make sense.
Yeah.
So I'll take those names. Cool.
I'm also curious if I think there's somewhere in there where we lay out the high level steps of what happens, where it's like first we validate, then we execute, and we use that as sort of like a high level way to talk about the chapters of the spec. And I wonder if it's worthwhile to kind of come back to that section and like if we're introducing these two new verbs, then use that as like maybe there's some like notched in bullet points or something, like some way to describe like these are the main top level verbs we use to talk about the phases of going like actually running one of these operations end to end. Because I imagine otherwise like all these words end up being somewhat synonymous unless we super crisply define them. And it'd be cool if we had like one little terse high level summary that like showed you them all in context of one another.
Yeah, that
But
makes
they're not a
sense.
requirement, but it's just a suggestion to make it easier to understand.
Would you see that as something to introduce like fairly early in the execution chapter?
I'll need to like dig through to see if I have my own recollection was that there's somewhere pretty early on in the whole doc, maybe during intro, where we talk about at a very high level what happens when you run a GraphQL query or GraphQL operation, where we like introduce the concept of validation and execution as separate steps, which I think
Okay.
comes before the execution chapter entirely. I could be totally wrong, but I think that would be the place where you would put in the high level.
All right, I'll look through for that and see if I can see it. Otherwise, I'll add something like that near the beginning. Make sense?
Cool. Yeah.
Do we want to advance the other part, the renaming of the algorithms separately? The renaming of the execute selection set algorithm, because this is something that incremental delivery really needs.
Yep. Thank you for breaking those out separately. I think that one is much more straightforward, especially thanks to your detailed changes in the last month or so.
Perfect. Okay. One more topic and then on to the vibe check. All right, so we would like a way to disable error propagation. Error propagation is problematic for normalized caches and a whole bunch of other things, and it explodes data, so you can't use it. It has problems when it comes to like overlapping fragments because it breaks the isolation of those fragments and stuff like that. An error thrown in one fragment will potentially null out the results from another fragment. So we want a way to turn it off. And we've talked about a number of different ways of turning it off over the past year or two. And at the moment, the one that the nullability working group are proposing is the on error request parameter that a client may issue to a server. However, it would be really helpful if the server could also indicate that it supports such a parameter. That way, the tooling knows whether or not it should include that parameter. So in order to do so, what this current pull request is suggesting is a service capabilities. So this again is the result of communication, both last primary working group and the secondary one that follows it. And essentially, this allows us to indicate things that the service is capable of that aren't things that are necessarily part of something that would be indicated by the schema itself, by the type system. So for example, fragment arguments. Fragment arguments isn't something that the type system cares about. It doesn't care whether it supports this or not. This is something that the execution engine, parsing and execution, cares about. So the service capabilities could indicate that fragment arguments are supported, and then tooling knows that it can use it versus having to, for example, pre-compile the queries so that the server can handle them. Similarly, it could also indicate that turning off error propagation is an ability, because again, this isn't something that the type system cares about. It just knows whether a field is null or not. It doesn't care whether it's going to produce an error or not. So this again comes down to the execution engine, which is part of the service rather than the type system. What we've done is we've defined this in terms of reverse DNS string identifiers. So org.graphql.fragment arguments, for example, with the idea that you could also indicate other capabilities that your service has. You could indicate RFCs that we're currently experimenting with that you've enabled. You could indicate, for example, a version number that might be useful, or any other useful information, purely as metadata. And the result of previous discussions is, rather than this just being a simple list of identifiers, it should be essentially a key value store where each identifier can have a string value associated with it that may contain any additional information. By making it a string, we essentially allow it to be anything, because anything you can serialize to a string you can put there, and we can serialize anything to a string. But in general, we would rather that this is just used for simple string values. We've also introduced a top level Dunder service meta field that can be used to query the service. And you can use the Dunder type introspection to find out whether such a field would be supported by looking to see if the Dunder service type exists. So you can detect its existence through introspection, which is good, because this would be the first new meta field that we've added, I think, since the 2015 introduction of GraphQL, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, essentially, this is two features that are paired together. Service capabilities itself could go with whichever of the two of error behaviors or fragment arguments were to be merged first. So we could definitely pull it out and do it as its own separate pull request. At the moment, I've paired them together for simplicity. I don't think we would merge service capabilities without one of those things, because they are the motivating factor behind it, and they exist in the examples. But yeah, love to gather your thoughts on this.
I like it. It's something that we are asking for years, essentially. We discussed it mostly around in the transport level group, but like it's also would simplify schema capability checks, like if you support different stream and what version of different stream. I mean, you can probe for these things, but not in detail.
Would also generalize the generic introspection, which you now have to probe for, right?
There's been pushback against that, and so I've scoped that out. Essentially, if it can be derived from the introspection, then it should be derived from the introspection is the current rule on this. So this is very much scoped to things that cannot be derived from introspection.
Yeah, but in the case of defer or
yeah, absolutely.
Preview features, you could even ask, does it support this version of this thing?
Absolutely, and that's what it's there for. But once incremental delivery makes it into the specification, it would not need to have a final service capability, because you can just see that the directive exists in order to infer it.
I mean, what would
That was the source of the pushback on that one, to be clear. I want to try to keep this one narrow so we can get it through.
I like this one too. This now is just in the execution bit. That was already, I mean, we had discussions about having in the composite schema working group just before about exactly how do we identify what's supported on a subgraph. Does it support batching? Does it support variable batching and things like this? So that's great news. From a client perspective, might be like when you think from a, like if you want to know if nullability is, what nullability you support. I mean, yeah, you could generate the client based on the introspection result, I believe. That could work as well.
It would be good if we have a directive version of that.
Yes, exactly. That's
because that you can read the SDL for a lot of tooling, like for instance, for the composition that we do. We basically do it based on SDL because you don't want to have the server necessarily running.
Yeah, so this could easily be supported through a @service brackets capabilities : list of strings non-official directive on the schema, but it is, I think, explicitly not part of the schema. It's part of the service, so that would be like a workaround. I do quite like the idea of giving the service the option to print an SDL that includes a service definition alongside the schema definition. And that could quite likely just use a service keyword with the capabilities inside of it. From the preserve option value guiding principle, I think we should do service and then capabilities rather than just listing capabilities directly. I also quite like the idea of doing that in a really like straightforward way that doesn't need loads of escaping. So at the moment, I've kept in quite strict limitations on what the identifiers themselves can be, i.e. reverse DNS, alphanumerical, with dots. That way we can have a standard, we can support it in the parser without needing quote marks, but there is also push back against that, and that we should just put quote marks around it, and I'm also okay with that. It's just slightly less beautiful.
But the idea is to have directives correlate. Like, is it a directive what you just suggested, or?
If you look, it's in one of the comments that is open, but I will put it into the chat as well. I'm afraid it's not indented in the chat because it's dropped all my spaces, but essentially,
yes,
just
I saw that
keywords.
comment. But where would you put? So this would be a construct in the
potentially in the SDL, but this is okay. Not part of this pull request, to be clear. This is just thinking about what the future of this could be.
Right. I mean, we could like this is a change from the syntax. We could also go route that you have with, for instance, descriptions, not descriptions, with deprecated, where you have something specific in the introspection, but then just a directive in the SDL. Because a lot of tooling works on SDLs, and that's
it's so that's the thing. I mean, forgive my ignorance here, but I believe that a directive, I may miss a lot of content, but a directive would add so much value, because there's the two sides of this, right? One is during execution, you can get the capabilities. The other side is during anything else which is static, you could access these capabilities. So that would be really, really nice.
Yeah, I think the main issue with doing it with a directive is that it would indicate that this is a schema property, and it's not. We could do it with a document directive, but we don't have those yet, so we would need to add syntax for them. And if we're adding syntax for them, why not actually add syntax for a service while we're at it?
I
Because
agree.
either way, it would be a breaking change.
Yeah, if we do a breaking change, then we can go for the whole thing.
Yeah.
But my point is essentially, in the meantime, you could definitely just use a schema directive. I just don't think it should be the standardized approach for it.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, like, where do you need this information? Like, most likely you need it not during runtime. Most likely during runtime, it's already too late. Like, you want to generate your client specifically for nullability. You don't need any if, else, and buts in there. You can just generate it highly efficient for this feature. There will not be, like, from a client perspective, what you would have to do is you would essentially have to probe the server on during runtime when you open the page, check if it supports it, and then you can do it, or you just configure it on the client, of course.
Yeah, and that's how a lot of toolings work, right? They pull the introspection result and transform it into SDL, and then work on the SDL.
Yeah,
exactly. So is there any pushback against this? And keep in mind that the questions around exposing this as a directive and whatnot can be done as follow-up to this. Like, ideally, it would be nice to get the error handling out. It would also be nice to get the capabilities system out for use by composite schemas and fragment arguments and anything else. So is there any real pushback against this feature? And obviously, I know that many of you haven't had time to actually read the spec pull request yet, but just like top level. Maybe best to leave that as a task for you all to think about in the background, and please do comment on that pull request. I noticed that we're running low on time, so I just want to do a very quick vibe check. We proposed that we do a spec cut. We proposed the date of that be July the 1st, which is less than a month away. The main aim of that was to give us a chance to get the spec release out in time for GraphQL Conf. We could, if we wanted to, change the freeze date to the 1st of September. And that way we would freeze the spec in time for GraphQL Conf, even though we don't actually have the release itself out. So my question right now is, are there any features that we really think that we're likely to land in the next month and a half that wouldn't make the 1st of July spec cut, but would make a 1st of September that we really want to hold up for? Or should we just go ahead with the cut and everything else just goes into next year's release?
Can we get do you think we can get the nullability stuff in until September?
When you say the nullability stuff, do you mean the error handling, like on error?
Yeah, that you
we
can
just
disable
discussed?
the error handling. If we can get this in, I would wait for this. because that would make a huge impact.
As a 10-year anniversary thing of GraphQL, it does feel like changing the fundamental behavior of errors would be very appropriate to go out on the 10th anniversary. So
Yes.
I personally agree that yes, holding it up in order to get this through would be good. But
Yeah.
also that's very much based on what the group feel about this feature. It has bounced around through a number of implementations over the last year.
But it also means that we have to get the capability stuff in, and we also need to have it not just in the introspection, in my opinion, because tooling will work on not just inspecting runtime servers.
But you can already add a directive yourself that does this, right? Like you can add a custom directive trivially.
Yes, but like I'm thinking not only clients, we are also, as Pascal said, we discussed it today in the composite schema working group around the capabilities thing, and we were even discussing should we just introduce something for the composite schema spec, but that makes actually no sense when we do something that does actually the same thing in the core spec, right? So having then an intermediary in a side spec doesn't feel right.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, one idea to throw out there around the spec cut and including fairly large changes such as the errors and nullability would be to borrow an idea from the way that languages do these like big changes where you have a cut, you have like GraphQL 2025 edition that is fully formed but is not general availability yet. And so then like that gives a little bit of easing on the timeline because we can have like, okay, this is the 2025 cut, but it's still draft or something to allow time for just, I don't know, catching issues with the larger changes in it.
I think that's interesting. It's also worth noting that the like spec cut process is a formalism that the vast majority of GraphQL consumers do not care about. It is still worthwhile. You should still do it. And it still is very meaningful, and the timing is important here. I think actually the most important thing we can do is make sure that we have a spec cut on time for the conference, regardless of what we manage to capture in time. But if the scenario that occurs is that we do a spec cut of the 2025 edition, and then like 6 weeks later, all the nullability stuff is finally finished and lands in the draft, we're not going to tell people to like, don't pay attention to this until we do a spec cut, like some random time in the future. Like once it's in the draft, the odds that we make significant changes to it are quite low. And even if we did a spec cut, if we saw some critical bug, we would still tell people about that critical bug that we fixed in the draft. And so I don't think it should slow us down from making a lot of noise about the progress we've made on nullability. I think our aim for the nullability work should be to get it to a pre-GA state by the conference so that we can tell people to start trying it and using it and giving us feedback, so that when we do the sort of next incremental cut, which should not be like 2 or 3 years away by any means, we will have that feedback incorporated. And who knows, maybe we'll have even made more progress by then. That would be awesome. But my vibe check sense is that we should stick to our timeline so that we can instead go up on stage and say like, hey, happy 10 years. Look at all the incredible stuff that managed to make it into the next spec cut. And by the way, here's all the very active work that continues on for the next one.
Okay, cool. Let's advance this to RFC2 and merge it in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah. And the thing we should not do is like hastily merge something and then realize, oh shit, we missed something critical, and we forever regret our decision, which I don't think we'll do, because this one has been in the works for so long, and we are finally on a path that everyone feels pretty great about. So there's a non-zero odds that we actually do get this fully baked in the next month or two.
Michael, as said in the chat, it would be great to get the composite schemas input on this as well, because I know it's a feature that you folks have needed. And anyone else who has needs of the schema capabilities, please do chime in on that pull request. We can separate it out as a separate thing to deal with the capabilities separate from the on-error stuff. I think it needs to be merged before or with on-error. That's the main concern there.
Agreed. All right, folks, we will call it here. Martine, sorry for making the cut line right before yours, but hopefully we can get more discussion on your topic offline.
No,
But
the error propagation one is the important one. I'm glad we spent time on it.
But holy moly, folks, we made it through 21 out of 22 things in the time slot. So thank you all for the detailed discussion and all of the fantastic advancements of all the work that we're doing. This is really incredible. We've made a ton of progress. We'll keep the secondary one. I'm sure we'll be making progress on a lot of these things. So if you can and are interested, please join the secondary working group in 2 weeks' time. Because most of the stuff that is in hot development will be discussed then. And if I don't see you there, I'll see you in July's. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.